Chapter 1. A Freed Man.
"Hurry, Felix!"
shouted Spurious.
"Let's finish this job and get home. Some visitors are coming from Pompeii tomorrow. Cassia says they may have some work for us."
It's nearly ready, Master.
Answered Felix.
But I want to cut some tiles again. They don't fit as well as they should.
"They look fine,"
said Spurious. Felix said nothing. He knew Spurious was careless. He didn't understand that every tile is important to the final design of a mosaic. But Spurious didn't design the mosaics. Felix did. Soon, they heard voices in the hall. Their customer was back home. Quickly, Felix finished the last tiles.
"Where's my mosaic? Is it finished?"
"Come and see, Caius Calvinus Lepidus,"
shouted Spurious. Caius Calvinus Lepidus was an important man in Rome, a senator. He walked into the room to see the mosaic. Felix watched the customer's face carefully. Would he like it?
"It's more beautiful than I thought possible,"
said Lepidus. Spurious laughed politely.
"I'm pleased, sir, that you're happy with our work. It's getting late, so we must leave now. My wife, Cassia, will send the bill later. We must collect Petrus, my worker, who's finishing a job nearby."
"Won't you have some wine before you leave?"
asked Lepidus.
"Another time,"
answered Spurious.
"I promised to be home early, sir. You know how Roman wives can be."
He laughed weakly.
"Come, Felix."
Felix looked at the mosaic for the last time. It was always like saying goodbye to a child you love. He put away his things and followed Spurious towards the hall. Suddenly, there was a strange noise, and the floor seemed to move under his feet. There was a heavy stone statue just beside Spurious. It started to fall towards him. Without thinking, Felix pushed his master away from the statue. It crashed to the floor near them and broke into pieces.
"Earthquake!"
shouted Lepidus. Then the noise stopped, and all was quiet again. Spurious was sitting on the floor beside the broken statue. He was shaking.
"By the gods,"
he whispered.
"it just missed me. Without your push, Felix."
Felix found that he was shaking too.
It's nothing, Master.
He replied.
"This slave saved your life, Spurious.
Cried Lepidus.
Give him his freedom, man. I'll put my name to the papers."
"Felix, I can never thank you enough,"
said Spurious.
"From today, you're a freed man."
Felix gave his hand to Spurious.
Can you stand, Master?
"Thank you, Felix. I'm fine."
In the hall, Lepidus's wife was counting their slaves worriedly. Spurius and Felix didn't leave Lepidus's house for an hour. They needed to sit and talk about the earthquake. Although earthquakes were unusual in Rome, Lepidus explained that there had been more than usual lately south of the city. Nobody knew why. It was evening when they walked to the house where Petrus was waiting. Spurius had Felix's papers in his hand.
What about that earthquake?
Petrus asked at once.
I thought I was dying.
But you're fine. So, is the job finished?
Asked Spurius.
Of course, Master.
Said Petrus. He was a freed man, a slave no longer, but he still called Spurius Master.
He pays me, so it's safer to be polite.
He'd once told Felix.
Show us the mosaic,
said Spurius. He knew Felix would notice any mistakes. Felix looked at Petrus's work.
There's a blue tile in the wrong place in the sea, and one of the green garden tiles is broken,
he said.
Well, fix it quickly,
said Spurius.
Really, Petrus, why can't you ever finish a job without mistakes?
Felix didn't look at Petrus as he started work fixing things, but he could feel Petrus's eyes on his back, cold and hard. On the way back to Rome, there was not much conversation in the carriage. Spurius was thinking about his narrow escape from death. And Felix was looking at the papers in Spurius's hand. Was he really free? Petrus would be very angry about that, too. When they arrived at Spurius's house, Cassia was waiting.
Do you think this is a good time to return home?
Cassia asked.
The earthquake made us late,
started Spurius. Petrus and Felix quickly left the hall. They knew it was best to disappear quietly when Cassia was angry. Spurius followed his wife to their bedroom. There, he explained about the falling statue.
Caius Lepidus made me give Felix his freedom,
he said.
What could I do? He saved my life in front of the senator.
Cassia's dark eyes grew narrower as she thought hard.
We need Felix to stay in the business,
she said to Spurius finally.
People know he designs the mosaics, and they're starting to ask for his work. Now, he'll stay with us for a time, because he'll feel grateful to you for giving him his freedom. That's good. But how long will he stay if someone offers him a better job and more money?
She stopped speaking and drank from the cup beside the bed.
I have an idea,
she continued.
Flavia must marry Felix. Then he'll be one of the family, and we can keep his designs forever.
Spurious's mouth dropped open.
Flavia, our daughter, marry a freed slave? Are you mad? She has very different ideas.
Cassia laughed.
Oh, yes. She has other ideas, all right. You don't see what's under your nose. She thinks she's in love with Petrus. If she's stupid enough to want to marry one freed slave, she can marry another. She must marry Felix for the business.
Spurius was really too tired to argue any more.
Let's sleep now, wife.
He said.
We'll talk again in the morning.
Cassia looked at his tired face.
You sleep, husband,
She answered.
I'll plan for the future.
As Spurius fell asleep, Cassia smiled to herself. What a clever idea it was! The business would grow, and her family would become rich and famous. The gods were helping her, even with their little earthquakes. Chapter 2. Graffiti. Flavia got up early the next morning. She and Petrus were planning to ask Spurius if they could marry each other. But as Flavia was going to join Petrus in the garden, she met Cassia.
Flavia,
Her mother said.
come. I have something to tell you.
Flavia followed Cassia into Spurius's office. Minutes later, Petrus heard screams. Then Flavia ran out into the garden. Her face was red. Petrus took her in his arms.
What's happened?
He asked. When he heard about Cassia's plan, he was very surprised.
You? Marry Felix? But he's a slave and almost a child.
Mother says he isn't a slave anymore.
Cried Flavia.
He's a freed man, and she wants him to join the business as a partner.
What? A partner before me? And your husband?
Petrus cried,
Calm down.
said Flavia, a little frightened.
Everyone will hear.
Just then, Felix crossed the hall on his way to see Spurius. He wanted to ask if he could go out and see Rome as a freed man.
Good morning.
He said happily to Petrus and Flavia.
Good morning.
Replied Flavia quietly. Petrus said nothing.
Oh dear. He's still angry with me about yesterday.
Thought Felix as he went to find Spurius.
What can we do about Felix?
Asked Flavia when Felix had gone.
Get rid of him.
Said Petrus.
But his mosaic designs are so good.
said Flavia.
And Mother thinks he's wonderful.
Then we must change her mind about him. What does your mother hate most?
Asked Petrus.
She worries all the time about what the neighbours think of us.
Answered Flavia at once.
That's it.
Said Petrus.
We'll write some really bad graffiti about her and make it seem like Felix wrote it. We'll say that she's in love with one of the neighbours.
But Mother doesn't even like the neighbours,
said Flavia.
Nobody will believe it.
People love hearing bad stories. And the neighbours don't like her much, do they? They won't mind if it's true or not. Cassia knows that.
Flavia thought for a moment.
It might work,
she said finally.
Let's do it.
I'll write the graffiti this afternoon, when everyone is sleeping. Then let's see what happens to Felix,
said Petrus. He kissed Flavia quickly on the top of her head. At the same time, Felix finished talking to Spurius. He took his new papers and went out to enjoy his first day as a freed man. Cassia was getting everything ready for their visitors from Pompeii. Some friends from Rome had told them about Spurius's mosaic business, and they wanted to see some mosaics. They finally arrived an hour late. Spurius, Cassia, and Flavia were waiting for them in the hall, in their best clothes.
Welcome, Bassus and Festus,
said Spurius as they came up the steps to the house.
It's an honor to have you with us.
Bassus, a tall man, slapped Spurius cheerfully on the back.
Happy to be here at last,
he said.
Come on, Festus, my friend. Hurry up those steps.
Festus couldn't walk very easily. Flavia wondered if he was ill.
Would you like something to eat?
Asked Cassia politely.
By Jupiter, that's a good idea,
said Bassus loudly.
The bottle of wine we had in the carriage hasn't done Festus any good.
Festus arrived in the hall.
A nice house,
he said to Spurius.
But too many steps to the door.
Then he noticed Flavia.
And who's this lovely young lady?
Let me introduce my daughter, Flavia,
said Spurius.
Hello, my dear,
said Festus.
Now, did somebody say something about food?
Cassia clapped her hands, and the slaves brought the food to the dining room. The meal was a strange one. Festus and Bassus were clearly drunk, but they asked for more wine. They got louder and louder. Flavia and Cassia were not speaking to each other. Only Spurius tried to make polite conversation. Bassus explained that he had a very special reason for wanting a new mosaic.
I've been repairing my house ever since the last big earthquake 17 years ago. It's nearly finished, but I need something really very special to finish the garden room.
He said.
Then I'll have a big party there.
Good idea.
Said Festus.
Don't forget to invite me.
After lunch, the two visitors said they wanted to visit the nearly finished Colosseum.
Do you want to see some mosaics before you go?
Asked Cassia.
No, dear lady.
Answered Festus.
After we come back, we want to see the Colosseum first. When the gladiator fights start there, we'll visit Rome often to see them.
Is the graffiti ready?
Said Flavia to Petrus when the guests had left. Petrus took her outside and showed it to her. Cassia's in love with Titus Germanicus, twice as old as her.
It looks just like Felix's writing.
Said Flavia.
My mother's gone for a rest now. We'll see what happens when she wakes up.
2 hours after that, the storm broke.
Where's Felix?
Screamed Cassia, red in the face.
He's gone out, dearest.
Answered Spurius.
Why?
Cassia took her husband to see the graffiti on the outside wall of their house.
How could he?
She shouted.
Me and that stupid 80-year-old man next door. It's crazy. And to say I'm only half as old as him. It's too much.
Spurius read the graffiti.
I'll speak to Felix as soon as he gets back.
He said carefully.
Speak to him?
Screamed Cassia.
You'll do more than that. I never want to see his face again.
Chapter 3. To Pompeii. Bassus and Festus were both very happy when they returned from the Colosseum.
There are no gladiator fights there yet. Not until the building opens.
So, we've still got all our money.
They told Spurius.
Show us your mosaics. We're ready to buy.
Where's your lady wife?
She's resting.
Answered Spurius. He hadn't seen Cassia since she'd gone to her room. He took the two visitors to the garden room and showed them Felix's mosaic on the floor there.
That's beautiful,
said Festus.
We have some wonderful mosaics in Pompeii, but I've never seen a better one than this. The design's clever, and the colors are most unusual. Did you design it?
Spurius was an honest man.
Ah, my slave. No, freed man, Felix, did it.
He answered.
Then I'd like to order one of his designs at once,
said Bassus. Spurius looked very worried.
Aren't you pleased with my order?
Asked Bassus.
I'll pay you well. What's the matter, by Jupiter?
Spurius ordered some food for his visitors and asked them to sit down on a couch. Perhaps these men could help him with Cassia.
I'm very happy with your order,
He explained.
The problem is my wife. She wants me to get rid of Felix.
Is she crazy?
Asked Festus.
That young man's worth a lot of money to your business.
Spurius showed them the graffiti in Felix's writing.
Look, it's just a boy's joke.
Laughed Bassus.
That's what happens when you give a slave his freedom.
He thought for a moment.
Listen. We'll take the boy to Pompeii to make a mosaic for me at once. Then your wife won't see his face for a while, and she'll forget about this graffiti. We'll punish him with hard work.
It seemed a good way out of the problem. So, that evening, Spurius told Felix he had to go with Bassus to Pompeii for a new job. He also showed Felix the graffiti.
I never wrote that,
Said Felix.
But it's your writing.
Said Spurius.
You're lucky you still have a job. Just go to Pompeii and stay out of Cassia's way.
Felix realized that Spurius didn't believe him. But who had written that graffiti? And why? He had no idea. Early the next morning, Felix was ready to leave with Bassus and Festus. As Bassus was getting into the carriage, he saw Petrus and Flavia laughing together.
Does that man work for you too?
He asked Spurius.
I need this mosaic quickly, and I could use another worker.
Spurius looked at Cassia, who stood near him. She nodded. He realized she wanted Petrus far away from Flavia.
Pack your things.
He said to Petrus.
You must go with Felix to work in Pompeii until Bassus's mosaic is finished. I'll find other help here in Rome.
Petrus stared. This was not part of his plan. Flavia turned white.
Hurry up!
Said Bassus.
We have a ship to catch from Ostia.
Felix wasn't happy either. He was hoping to get away from Petrus as well as Cassia. He had decided that staying in Pompeii for a while might be good for him. Petrus looked sadly at Flavia and went to fetch his things. What could he say?
All right.
He whispered as he passed her and joined Felix. At 12, Bassus and his group caught a ship from Ostia to Herculaneum. Petrus was not speaking to Felix.
I didn't ask Spurius to send Petrus to Pompeii,
Thought Felix.
so why is Petrus angry with me again?
It was warm for the time of year, and as night fell, Felix went for a walk along the deck. It was a beautiful night, and he felt happy to be away from Rome for the first time. His only worry was how to prove his innocence to Spurius. A gentle wind was blowing. It was wonderful to be free. Suddenly, he felt a strong man's arm around his neck. Someone was attacking him from behind and trying to push him over the side of the ship into the sea. Felix remembered something a friend had once told him. If you're attacked from behind, drop to your knees. The attacker will fall with you. He dropped suddenly to his knees and turned quickly round. He grabbed the other man's feet and pulled him down to the deck. Suddenly, he could see the man's face in the moonlight. It was Petrus. His face was dark with anger.
I'm going to kill you, Felix!
He screamed as the ship suddenly hit a big wave and moved over to one side.
You can't have my job and my woman!
Your woman?
Shouted Felix against the wind.
Who's that?
Flavia, of course!
Cried Petrus.
I don't love Flavia.
Shouted Felix.
She's too old for me. And she's a Roman citizen. You're crazy.
Slowly, Petrus sat back on the deck.
But Cassia told Flavia to marry you.
He said.
And Cassia wants you to be a partner in the business.
Felix smiled.
Me? A partner? That's not very probable. Cassia's sent me away to Pompeii because she thinks I wrote some crazy graffiti about her love life. Really, Petrus, I know nothing about her plans and ideas. And I'll never marry a woman I don't love, no matter what Cassia or anybody wants.
Petrus looked confused.
I'm sorry.
He said.
I miss Flavia so much. I don't know what I'm doing. Good night, Felix.
He said, and walked slowly away. Felix watched Petrus as he left. He felt exhausted after the fight. Petrus was a strong man.
I need to think about this,
he thought.
How can the two of us work together? I'll talk to him in the morning.
Chapter 4. Slave Girl in Blue. In the morning, the weather was bad. Most people on the boat felt ill. Petrus stayed in bed until they arrived at the port of Herculaneum. There, Bassus paid for 2 horses, and he and Festus rode to the baths in Pompeii. Petrus and Felix walked at their side.
Festus and I need a bath after that journey.
Bassus said.
You two can come with us. I'll explain about the mosaic on the way. I want the design in 2 days, and you'll have no free time until the mosaic is finished. You, Felix, may not leave my house because of your stupid joke in Rome. Petrus, you can go out only to collect tiles for the mosaic. I'll show you the shop you must use, and I'll open an account there. But don't waste my money. Any questions?
Not at the moment.
answered Petrus.
Good.
Said Bassus. They travelled to Pompeii in silence. There were big houses beside the sea, and the road, with palm trees beside it, was full of horses and their rich riders. Festus and Bassus were chatting.
So much money.
Whispered Felix to Petrus.
Wait until you see the city itself.
Petrus whispered back. The walls of the city appeared in front of them. They went in through a busy gate and past some beautiful buildings before arriving at the baths. How rich these people of Pompeii were! Inside the baths, there were mosaics on every wall and floor. Felix noticed a beautiful blue colour he had never seen before.
Can we use that blue in our design?
He asked Petrus, as they held the towels for Bassus and Festus.
It's a popular colour here in Pompeii.
Replied Petrus.
How do you know?
Asked Felix.
I've been here before, a long time ago.
Said Petrus.
I was a child then, but I remember the colour.
Bassus shouted to them from the water.
Your mosaic must be ready by August the 23rd. I'm having a party then, and I've invited the most important people in the city. I want to be a senator, and I'll need a lot of friends to help me do that.
Friends aren't easy to keep here.
Added Festus. Bassus and Festus came out of the water, and Petrus and Felix put the towels round them.
Right,
Said Bassus.
now listen carefully, you two. In my mosaic, I want to see the young god of love, Cupid, and his mother, Venus, playing on the beach, with our mountain, Vesuvius, behind them. Felix, can you design that?
I can. Just give me 2 days.
Answered Felix.
Good.
Said Bassus.
Bring me the drawing when it's ready. Now, let's go to the tile shop and open an account.
If you tell me the address, sir, and write a short letter to the owner, we'll go there for you and you can stay here.
Said Petrus.
You'll never find the shop.
Said Bassus, surprised.
I know the city a little.
Answered Petrus.
We'll find it.
Very well.
Answered Bassus.
Come straight to my house when you've finished. It's in the Street of Plenty. I'll take Festus home, and then warn my wife that you're coming. Don't lose Felix in the crowds. We don't want our designer to run away.
10 minutes later, Felix followed Petrus into the streets of Pompeii. The people spoke in a strange way, and some of them didn't look Roman. The shops were selling fruit and vegetables he'd never seen before.
There are people from all over the empire here.
Said Petrus.
Some come from the north and some from Africa. You'll see lots of slaves from Greece, too.
He stopped in a street market.
I can't remember this square.
He said.
It must be new.
On the far side of the square, Felix saw a slave girl. She had a basket by her and was buying some fruit. She had beautiful yellow hair and blue eyes. Her tunic was bright Pompeian blue. Just then, She looked across the square and saw Felix. His heart jumped. She was so beautiful. The young woman gave him a small smile. Then she left the square with her basket of fruit. Felix wanted to follow her, but Petrus put a hand on his arm.
I know where we are now.
He said.
The tile shop's this way.
The young woman disappeared. Felix had lost her. In a dream, he followed Petrus to the tile shop and on to Bassus's house. Petrus talked about Pompeii, but Felix didn't hear a word. He woke up only when a slave opened the door of the house and a tall, proud woman stood before him.
Petrus and Felix, I suppose,
she said, looking at their dirty clothes and shoes.
Come in.
She turned to the slave at the door. He was tall and fair.
Take these men to wash,
she said.
Then give them something to eat, and show them to an empty room near the slaves' room.
She turned back to Petrus and Felix.
My name's Rectina, and I'm your mistress now,
she said. As they followed the slave, Petrus and Felix saw Bassus in the dining room. He was drinking again, although it was still early in the day.
Join me for some wine,
he shouted to Rectina.
I have work to do,
she replied.
She's as cold as a fish,
said Bassus, half to himself. Petrus and Felix moved on.
So,
thought Felix,
Bassus and Rectina hate each other. It won't be easy living here.
Chapter 5. Venus's Face. Later that evening, Felix and Petrus were chatting.
What a wonderful city,
said Felix.
but I'll never really have a chance to see it. How can I prove my innocence to Spurius and to Bassus? I never wrote that graffiti. But who hates me enough to write that kind of thing in my name?
You were taking everything I loved from me,
began Petrus. Felix stared at him, surprised.
So, it was you? But why?
I'm sorry, Felix. I was desperate.
You must write to Spurius at once and tell him the truth,
said Felix angrily.
I'll lose my job,
said Petrus.
That's not my problem,
shouted Felix. Just then, someone knocked on their door. It was the tall slave with some food for them.
What's your name?
Asked Felix.
Alcander.
Replied the young man.
I'm Greek.
So, Alcander, could you please tell us more about the people we're working for?
Continued Felix.
What would you like to know?
Asked Alcander.
Well,
said Petrus,
we already know that Bassus drinks. We saw that in Rome.
Yes,
said Alcander.
the master drinks for 2 reasons. First, he was famous, handsome, and good at sport when he was young. He used to drive a chariot in the races, and he misses the life he had then. He often talks about it. Secondly, he married Rectina only for her money. She comes from an old rich family, and she fell in love with and married the young charioteer. But she soon realized he wasn't in love with her. He spent his time with other women. So she grew to hate him.
I see.
said Petrus.
Thank you, Alcander.
On the way to the bathroom, Felix saw a slave girl walking beside Rectina in the garden. She was wearing a bright blue tunic. As they turned the corner, the young woman looked up and saw Felix. It was the young shopper from the market. She looked as surprised as Felix was. Alcander passed by with some wine for Bassus.
Who's that young woman?
Felix whispered.
My sister, Agatha.
He answered. For the next few weeks, Felix and Petrus worked hard. Petrus wrote and sent the letter about the graffiti to Spurius. They waited for an answer. Sometimes Petrus went into the city for tiles. He usually stayed out a long time. Alcander said that Petrus often met an older woman there, but Petrus never spoke of this to Felix. And Felix didn't mind, because it meant he had more chances to talk to Agatha alone. If Rectina was out, Agatha watched him while he worked. They chatted and laughed together. Alcander was pleased that his sister was happy and didn't disturb them. On August the 20th, the weather was hot as usual. The mosaic was nearly finished. But Felix hadn't started Venus's face.
You'll have to do her face soon,
said Petrus.
The party's in 3 days,
added Alcander.
I know,
said Felix, blushing.
I'm just finishing the drawings.
Agatha passed by with a cup of water. She smiled at them.
Venus might have a sweet smile like that,
said Petrus. Felix laughed and blushed again. He couldn't hide his feelings. Suddenly, there was a noise from under the ground, which started to shake.
Lie down, everyone!
Shouted Alcander. There was a scream. Agatha had dropped the water and slipped on the wet stone floor. She fell heavily to the ground. The earthquake stopped after a few seconds, and all was quiet. Alcander jumped up and ran to his sister. Felix was just behind him. Alcander looked at Agatha's foot.
Don't try to get up,
he told her.
You've hurt your ankle. Felix, please fetch my medicines and some cold water.
Alcander knew about plants which help people when they are ill. His father had taught him many old Greek medicines. Felix ran to Alcander's room and came back almost immediately. But before Alcander could do much, Agatha began speaking in a strange, deep voice. Her eyes were closed.
The god Neptune is angry,
she said.
The gods will speak from the ground, the mountains, and the sea. They'll punish us.
Felix was worried.
Wake up, Agatha!
He shouted.
Don't.
Said Alcander.
She can't hear anyone. Just listen. It's dangerous to disturb her. This happens sometimes. She was born with a special gift from the gods. She can see the future.
Agatha's eyes were still closed.
Beware, people of Pompeii. You have wasted the gifts of the gods, and your life will disappear from the face of the earth.
What does she mean?
Whispered Petrus. Suddenly, Agatha's body shook. She opened her eyes.
Alcander? What's happened? My ankle hurts.
There was an earthquake, and you slipped.
Said Alcander calmly.
Now lie still, while I bandage your ankle.
Thank you, brother.
She said, putting her head on the cushion that Felix had brought. Then she noticed the others.
Why are you all staring?
She asked. She turned to Alcander.
Have the gods been speaking through me again?
Yes. But just rest.
Answered her brother.
Leave us now, please.
He said to Felix and Petrus. Petrus went into the garden, and Felix sadly followed him.
What does she mean?
Asked Petrus.
I hate these earthquakes, but what Agatha said is terrible. The people here are rich, but they're not all bad. She can't mean they will all die.
Just then, they heard voices in the hall. It was Bassus and Festus, and they sounded drunk again.
Alcander!
Shouted Bassus.
Take my cloak. These young slaves are useless.
He said to Festus.
One small earthquake and they forget everything. Just like all those idiots in the street, running around everywhere. Doesn't anyone remember what we had 17 years ago? Now that really was an earthquake. These little tremors are nothing. Alcander! Where are you?
Alcander had finished putting the bandage on Agatha's ankle, so he went and took Bassus's cloak. Rectina came from her room.
Husband, what's all this noise? I was sleeping.
You've slept through a small earthquake,
replied Bassus. Just then, Rectina noticed Agatha on the floor.
What's wrong with her?
She asked.
She's hurt her ankle.
Said Alcander.
And can't walk.
He picked Agatha up and carried her to the slaves' bedrooms.
Never mind her,
said Bassus.
Is the mosaic damaged?
Felix checked it.
Just a little, sir.
He said.
But I can repair it.
Then do it, and finish it,
said Bassus.
A small earth tremor doesn't mean a holiday in my house.
Nothing does,
whispered Petrus to Felix.
We need more blue tiles for the sea, sir,
he told Bassus.
May I go to the shop now?
Not alone,
said Bassus.
A letter came from Spurius this morning. He tells me you're the one who wrote that graffiti in Rome. Clearly, I can't let you out alone anymore. Felix is busy with the mosaic, so Alcander will go with you.
10 minutes later, Alcander and Petrus were on their way.
Is Pompeii really in danger?
Petrus asked.
What Agatha sees always happens,
Answered Alcander.
but we never know when. It could be years from now.
But what about the earthquake?
Earthquakes often happen here.
Said Alcander.
It doesn't mean much. But there have been more than usual recently.
When they reached the shop, it was closing,
Earthquakes are bad for business.
said the owner.
I'm going home, like my customers. People are worried about their families.
Can we just take our tiles?
Asked Petrus.
Yes,
Said the owner.
but be quick.
Once they were home, Alcander made a special drink for Agatha to lessen the pain in her ankle. Petrus took the tiles to Felix.
Can you work without me for a while?
Felix asked.
Festus has gone, and Bassus is asleep. I want to see how Agatha is.
When he arrived at her room, she was just finishing her drink. She smiled at Felix.
Sleep now.
Said Alcander.
The drink will take the pain away.
Can I stay and watch her?
Felix asked.
I need to make sure my drawing of her face is right.
He added. Alcander smiled.
Would you like Felix to stay?
He asked Agatha.
Yes, please.
She answered. At the door to the room, Alcander looked back. Felix was sitting with his pencil in his hand, quietly watching Agatha. Her eyes were closed, and she looked very beautiful.
Those two look right together.
Alcander thought as he left.
CD 2.
Chapter 6. The Party. On the day of the party, Felix started work early. He wanted to check that the mosaic was perfect. Bassus had put up a curtain in front. He planned to pull it back and surprise his guests in the middle of the party. Felix was not the only one up early. All the slaves were working hard, and Rectina was busy screaming at them. By lunchtime, it was very hot. Rectina went to her room to rest, taking Agatha with her. Felix finished his work and wanted Petrus to see the mosaic. But Petrus was not in the house,
Someone brought him a message,
said Alcander.
and he hurried out. We'll tell Bassus he's ill in bed, if he asks.
Right. Well, would you like to see the mosaic?
Asked Felix.
Of course.
Said Alcander. Together, they went behind the curtain. Alcander studied the picture silently for a while.
What do you think?
Felix asked worriedly.
It's the most beautiful mosaic I've ever seen.
Said Alcander.
And the most beautiful Venus, too.
He smiled. 2 hours later, Guests started arriving. They were all richly dressed. Alcander told Felix about them.
That's a famous general,
He said,
with his fat wife. The young man in the corner is a charioteer, the winner of this year's most important race. He's very famous in Pompeii at the moment. The old woman talking to him is the wife of a senator. He's not enjoying the conversation, is he?
He seems more interested in the girl over there.
said Felix.
He's got no hope with her.
Replied Alcander.
Her father wants her to marry Rectina's uncle, Scissa. He's got the biggest house in Herculaneum. He's the man beside the fountain.
But he's ancient,
Whispered Felix. Just then, Bassus clapped his hands.
Before we eat,
He said proudly.
I'd like to show you all my new mosaic. Where's Felix? Pull the curtain, boy. Let's see your work.
Felix shyly pulled back the curtain. His legs were shaking. Would all these important people like the mosaic? There was a short silence. Then everyone started speaking at once.
Wonderful!
He heard.
Really unusual work.
Look at the face of that Venus.
The blue of the sea is the best I've seen.
Suddenly, a slave dropped a cup of wine. It was Agatha. She was staring at Venus's face. It was her own.
Stupid child.
Shouted Bassus. He lifted his hand to slap Agatha. Suddenly, Felix came between them.
Sir,
He shouted.
if you like my mosaic, I ask you to play dice with me for the freedom of this girl. If I lose, you can have my freedom.
The general spoke for the crowd of guests.
It's a fair plan, Bassus.
He said.
Let's all watch the game.
Bassus couldn't refuse in front of his guests.
Bring the dice.
He shouted,
3 rolls of the dice.
said the general.
The highest number wins.
After 2 rolls, Bassus and Felix had the same number. Agatha was in the kitchen. She couldn't bear to watch. Bassus rolled for the 3rd time. It was a 5. Felix needed a 6. Things didn't look very hopeful,
How sad.
said the senator's wife.
He's a brave boy.
Bassus passed the dice to Felix.
You'll be a useful slave.
He laughed. Felix prayed to Jupiter, the king of the gods. Then he rolled.
A 6!
Shouted the general.
By all the gods, boy! You have some friends in high places.
Alcander ran to tell Agatha. Bassus stared darkly at the dice.
Time to eat.
Said Rectina quickly.
Please, choose a couch, everyone, and we'll have some food.
At once, the guests started choosing their places to lie and eat. Nobody noticed that Bassus was still staring angrily at the dice and at Felix. Felix moved away, and Rectina went to Bassus.
It's only a slave girl,
She said.
Go and talk to your guests. Don't you know how to lose a game yet?
The slaves brought in dish after dish to eat. The guests started with cheese and eggs. Then there was chicken and many kinds of vegetables. There were different wines with every dish, and soon almost everyone was a little drunk. Some slaves started to play music, and people began to dance. Suddenly, Felix noticed Petrus coming into the garden.
Where have you been?
He shouted to him over the noise of the music.
We told Bassus you were ill.
I found her at last.
Answered Petrus.
But it's too late. She's dying.
He looked white, and his face was wild.
Found who?
Asked Felix. He wondered if Petrus was drunk.
I can't hear you well. Let's go to our room.
No, I must speak to Bassus.
Said Petrus.
Bassus is drunk.
Said Felix.
He's with Festus by the fountain. It's not a good time to talk to him about anything.
Let me go!
Said Petrus, pushing Felix away.
My mother said...
Your mother?
Said Felix.
She's here in Pompeii.
Petrus walked straight to Bassus before Felix could stop him. He whispered something into Bassus's ear. Bassus jumped back from Petrus and fell into the fountain. He hit his head on the statue in the middle of it on the way down, and lay in the water without moving. Festus stared at Petrus.
What did you tell him?
He asked. Petrus tried to pull Bassus out of the water, but he was too heavy to move. Alcander hurried to help, and together they pulled Bassus out. He was still breathing, but his eyes were closed. Chapter 7. Father and Son. Few people noticed Bassus sitting on the ground. Most of the party guests were drunk, and some had left. Petrus went over and sat down beside him.
Open your eyes, Father.
He whispered. Alcander stared at him.
Your father?
My mother told me he was my father.
Said Petrus.
She wanted me to know before she died. Rectina doesn't know anything about me. Bassus sent me away to Rome when I was a young boy to keep me a secret. And now he's dying.
I don't think so.
Said Alcander.
It's just the fall and the drink. He'll wake up soon.
Morning was coming. A soft light was growing behind the mountain, and the stars were disappearing. Rectina passed Petrus and Bassus on her way to bed.
Drunk again?
She said, looking down at Bassus. Felix and Agatha were sitting quietly together near the mosaic.
You were crazy to play that dice game with Bassus,
said Agatha. Felix smiled. He was tired, but happy.
Now we can get married,
he answered.
We're both free. Who can stop us?
I must ask Alcander,
she replied.
He is my older brother.
Alcander came up behind them with some water for Bassus.
What do you want to ask me?
Can I marry Felix?
She said.
Of course. And you can move to Rome with him.
Answered Alcander.
And have a new life there. But for now, you must sleep.
As lunchtime arrived, people started to wake up. It was very hot. The last guests went home, one by one. Agatha woke up and ran to find Felix, who was sleeping in the garden.
Wake up!
She shouted.
Something bad's on its way.
Suddenly, all the dogs started howling. Agatha fell into Felix's arms, and her eyes closed.
The gods are punishing us,
She sang in a strange, low voice. There was a huge noise from under the ground. Everything started shaking.
Look at the mountain,
Whispered Agatha, opening her eyes. Felix looked at Vesuvius behind them. Suddenly, a pillar of white smoke came from the top of it. The noise continued. Bassus opened his eyes and looked at Petrus.
What's happening?
He asked.
I don't know.
Answered Petrus.
I've never seen anything like it before. Father?
Bassus stared at Petrus.
Ah, yes. I remember now.
He said.
You're Lavinia's boy. I sent you to Rome when you were only a child. Welcome home.
Everyone except Bassus and Petrus was staring at the mountain. The earth stopped shaking, but the noise continued.
Is it smoke?
Asked Felix. The white pillar went higher and higher into the blue sky.
No,
Said Alcander.
it's ash. I've read about this in ancient books. Vesuvius must be a volcano.
What's that?
Asked Agatha.
A mountain with fire inside.
Said Alcander.
The fire in its heart comes from deep under the ground.
As they watched, the smoke spread out over the sky. It looked like a big, white palm tree. Suddenly, they heard Rectina's voice. She was now standing close beside them.
That ash is going to fall on us,
She said.
My old friend Admiral Gaius Plinius has told me about volcanoes.
It was the middle of the day, but the cloud above them was starting to cover the sun.
We must leave at once.
She said.
We must go to the sea and escape in a boat. The ash will cover everything. To save all the people, we need lots of boats. Gaius Plinius has many ships at Misenum. I'll write to him, and someone must take him the letter.
Not me.
Said Bassus.
I can't stand up, and my head hurts.
Rectina looked at him coldly.
This is a job for strong, young men,
she said.
Alcander can go because he knows the way to Mycenum, and Felix must go with him. Get ready, you two. Take 2 of my horses. You'll travel faster if you ride. We'll wait for you at the port of Herculaneum. Agatha, bring my writing things to my room.
Agatha followed her out of the garden. Small stones were starting to fall from the sky. One of them landed in the fountain,
We must go inside.
said Alcander.
Help me to carry my father.
Said Petrus. Together, they took Bassus inside,
I'm not going anywhere without Agatha.
said Felix.
You'll have to ride under the falling stones.
Said Petrus.
It's not safe for her. And remember her bad foot. She can't ride a horse.
He's right.
Said Alcander.
We can't take her.
He went out to find the horses,
Felix, don't worry.
said Petrus.
I'll take Agatha with Bassus and Rectina to the port at Herculaneum. You'll soon get there with the ships, and we can all escape together.
Felix shook his head.
I don't like it.
He said. Rectina came back with the letter,
I found Festus sleeping in the dining room,
she said.
so his carriage is still here. We can reach Herculaneum in that.
Alcander came in,
The horses are ready, Felix.
he said. Agatha turned to Felix.
I'm coming with you.
She cried,
It's too dangerous.
answered Felix.
You still can't walk well, and you won't be able to ride a horse. Petrus has promised to look after you. We'll meet again at Herculaneum.
Agatha,
Said Alcander,
please go with the others.
You're wasting time.
shouted Rectina.
Look at the sky. There'll be no light soon. Go now for the people of Pompeii.
Alcander took Felix's arm,
Come on.
he said.
It's kinder to go quickly.
The 2 young men hurried out of the room. Petrus held Agatha in his arms. She was trying to follow Felix and her brother. Festus came into the hall,
My carriage is ready.
he said.
The streets are full of people and more stones are falling. We must leave at once. Help me with Bassus.
Said Petrus. The 2 men carried Bassus out to the carriage,
Hurry!
said Rectina to Agatha.
And stop crying. You'll have a reason to cry if a stone hits you. Can't you walk faster?
They were now out in the street.
Leave her alone,
Petrus said to Rectina.
or you can stay here by yourself. Your other slaves have run away already.
Don't speak to me like that.
Screamed Rectina. Just then, a big stone landed beside her. She jumped into the carriage quickly. Petrus lifted Agatha gently into the carriage and climbed in after her. Festus hurriedly tried to start the horses, but it was difficult. The stones were hitting them, and they were jumping wildly. Finally, they started to move through the crowded streets. People were running around alone or in groups. Many were looking for children or other people in their families. It was getting darker and darker, and the mountain was still very noisy. More and more ash was falling from the sky. When they got closer to the city walls, the streets were crowded with carriages. Everybody was trying to get out of the city towards the sea. After a long time, they reached the Herculaneum Gate in the northwest. And when they arrived, they found people everywhere. Festus had to hit them with the horse's whip to get through the crowds. Children were screaming, men were shouting, women were crying, and dogs were howling. Some people were carrying bags of money with them.
Gods above! Save us!
Shouted Rectina as they passed through the gate at last. Festus drove as fast as he could through the crowds, but it was impossible to pass other carriages on the road. Bassus was lying with his head on Petrus's knees. His eyes were closed again. Petrus looked back at Pompeii. He could see nothing except for the pillar of white ash coming out of the mountain. But he could hear lots of screams.
It's like a picture of Hades, the land of the dead.
He whispered to Agatha.
You were right. You saw this. The gods are killing the people of Pompeii. Pray for us now, Agatha. The gods may listen to you. It's our only hope.
Chapter 8. The Admiral. Alcander and Felix rode fast through Herculaneum. It was darker and hotter, because they were nearer to Vesuvius than before. The road was crowded with people going to the beaches.
I know a quick way across the fields,
Shouted Alcander to Felix.
Come on, follow me.
They heard the sea before they could see it. Waves were crashing wildly onto the beach, and hot stones from the volcano were falling into the water.
I've never seen waves like this.
Alcander said. They both looked back towards the mountain. The pillar of ash was getting higher and higher, and the sun had disappeared.
Let's go,
Said Felix.
we must find Gaius Plinius.
They rode on to the north and into the wind. The horses were getting tired, and they had to slow down. But little by little, some light came back.
Has it stopped?
Asked Felix. They stopped the horses and looked back. The pillar of ash was still there, and the fires on the mountain. But the noise was less, because they were further away.
No,
Said Alcander.
but look at the cloud of ash. The wind is blowing it south. It's covering Pompeii, but not here. We can even see the sun again.
They rode back to join the road to Neapolis. It was still crowded with people coming away from Herculaneum. They were very tired and covered with ash. The people who lived in houses and farms along the road were watching the people on the road.
What's happening in Herculaneum?
They asked.
The end of the world.
Answered one man.
Stones and fire are falling out of the sky.
He's drunk.
Said one farmer to another. Alcander heard them.
Leave your homes.
He said to the farmers.
You're not safe here. If the wind changes, the cloud will come here too. And the mountain hasn't stopped. The ash could easily cover all the country around here, as well as the city itself.
You're crazy,
answered the farmer.
Do you think we're going to leave our good land because a slave is afraid of a cloud?
It's no use,
said Felix.
We're wasting time. Let's go on.
A short time later, Felix's horse suddenly stopped.
There's something wrong with my horse. I think she stepped on something sharp.
He shouted to Alcander. Alcander rode back to Felix and checked the horse's feet. In one of them, he found a sharp stone. He pulled it out, but the horse's foot was bleeding badly.
She can't even walk easily now,
said Alcander. He led the horse into a field beside the road.
We'll both have to ride my horse,
he said. Felix jumped up behind Alcander, and they rode on again. Together, they were heavy, and the horse could only walk slowly. They passed Neapolis. Finally, they could see Misenum ahead of them beside the sea. But the horse dropped its head and stopped moving forwards.
We'll have to walk the rest of the way,
said Felix. At last, they reached Misenum. They asked for Gaius Plinius, admiral of the Roman navy, and they were sent to a big house by the sea. There were 2 guards outside the house. When they saw Felix and Alcander, they crossed their swords in front of the door. Felix found his papers in the pocket of his tunic and showed them to the guards. Alcander gave them the letter from Rectina. As soon as he saw Rectina's seal, the big guard put down his sword.
We come from Pompeii,
said Felix.
This letter is for Gaius Plinius from his friend Rectina. The city is in danger, and our mistress asks for the help of the Roman navy.
Show them in,
said the big guard to the smaller one.
quickly.
Felix and Alcander followed the guard into the house. The hall was huge, and there seemed to be doors to lots of rooms.
Where's the admiral?
The guard asked a slave.
On the balcony,
Answered the slave.
he's watching Vesuvius.
Felix and Alcander followed the guard to the balcony. An old man was standing there, looking out to sea. Across the beautiful bay, Vesuvius stood out clearly. The ash pillar was climbing higher and higher, and spreading fast south and east.
Write this down, Pliny.
Said the admiral to a young man at a table.
The cloud is growing by the second, and we can see more and more ash coming out of the top of the mountain.
Sir,
Said the guard.
here are some men with a letter for you.
No time for letters.
Said Gaius Plinius.
This is much too interesting. We must write it all down for our grandchildren's grandchildren to read.
He didn't turn round.
Sir,
Said Felix.
the letter is from Rectina in Pompeii. We've ridden as fast as we could to reach you. The people of Pompeii and Herculaneum are dying. They need your help.
At last, Gaius Plinius turned and looked at them.
By the gods!
He said.
From Pompeii? You look half dead.
Alcander replied calmly.
In Pompeii, it's like midnight. The cloud of ash has covered the sun. Stones are falling out of the sky and hurting people and animals. Everyone is running to the sea or hiding inside their houses. Please read our letter.
Gaius Plinius took the letter from Alcander's hand and read it.
Pliny,
He said to the young man at the table,
no more writing today. Come and read this letter from Rectina.
The young man went over to him with a pen in his hand.
My nephew, Gaius Plinius Caecilius.
Said the old man to Felix and Alcander.
We call him Pliny. You've done well.
Plinius went on, as Pliny was reading the letter.
Now leave everything to me.
But will you help them?
Asked Felix desperately.
Of course. There are thousands of Roman citizens in Pompeii and Herculaneum.
He looked at Alcander and smiled.
And slaves, too. I'll take my ships to Herculaneum as soon as they're ready.
Can we come?
Asked Alcander.
My sister.
I can't take any extra people.
Said Plinius.
Think how many people I have to bring back.
Then he looked at their tired, sad faces.
Oh, all right. But I'll take the freedman only. It's the best I can do. I'm sure he'll find your sister.
I will, sir. I promise.
Said Felix, and he looked at Alcander.
You can be sure of that.
Good. Now go and eat.
Said Plinius.
We leave in half an hour.
Felix and Alcander followed the slaves to the kitchen. Soon they were both eating. At the same time, Pliny was speaking to Gaius Plinius.
Go, uncle, but be careful.
The young man said.
Look at the sea. The waves are huge. We can't even see Herculaneum or Pompeii. How can you possibly find them and save the people there?
How can I possibly stay here?
Replied Plinius.
How can I tell the emperor that the Roman navy did nothing while thousands of citizens died? I must try to save them.
The admiral looked again at Vesuvius. Then he turned to Pliny.
The cloud of ash is growing still,
He said.
It's not safe here either. You must leave tomorrow morning at the latest. Take the road north to Rome and tell the emperor what's happened. We're going to need his help when Vesuvius and the gods have finished with us.
Shouldn't I wait for you to come back?
Argued Pliny.
Listen, boy.
Said Gaius Plinius quietly.
We may not come back. I'm an old man. It doesn't matter for me, but you must write what you see and remember everything for the future. Now, get ready to go.
Half an hour later, a slave found Felix still in the kitchen.
The ships are leaving.
He said.
The master says come now.
Felix didn't call Alcander, who was sleeping.
When my friend wakes up, tell him I'll find her.
Felix said to the slave.
He'll understand.
Soon after Felix arrived at the port, the ships left Misenum. They sailed quickly south with the wind behind them. Slaves pulled at the oars to help them move even faster. But as they came close to Herculaneum, it grew darker, and the sea grew wilder and wilder. Huge stones fell into the water. The ships tried to turn into the port. But the sea was full of rocks, and they were in danger. The sailors could hear people shouting, but they couldn't see the port. Falling ash started to cover the ships and the men. There was also a terrible smell, like bad eggs.
Back out to sea!
Ordered Gaius Plinius.
Run south with the wind. Save the ships. Sail for Stabiae.
No!
Screamed Felix, who stood beside him on the deck.
I'm sorry, my boy.
Said the old man.
There's nothing I can do for them. We must save ourselves.
As the ships ran south with the wind, Felix and the Admiral listened to the screams coming from the land. In his mind, Felix said goodbye to his beautiful Agatha. He would never see her again. Then, as they watched, a pillar of fire shot up into the air from the top of the mountain. It started to run down the side of the mountain towards Herculaneum faster than the wind itself. It looked like an angry snake, and the smell of gas grew even stronger.
Pull harder!
Shouted Plinius to the slaves who were rowing the ships.
This is no ordinary fire. It will burn everything in front of it.
As he spoke, the snake of fire reached the sea. There was a huge noise, and the water beside Herculaneum seemed to turn red and smoky. Luckily, the wind and the waves soon pushed them far away to the south.
Gods above. They must all be dead.
Whispered Plinius. And Felix realized that he could hear no more screams in the wind. Chapter 9. By Boat and Ship. Earlier that afternoon, Festus, Rectina, Agatha, Bassus, and Petrus had arrived, after their difficult journey over land, at the port of Herculaneum.
Get out!
Festus shouted to the others.
I'm going to find a boat.
Rectina and Agatha got out of the carriage. Petrus stayed inside with Bassus. There were hundreds of people all along the beach as far as they could see, and a few boats full of people out at sea.
Let's get back into the carriage, girl.
Rectina said to Agatha.
At least the stones can't hit us there.
Rectina got in, but Agatha stood with her eyes closed in the middle of the street. Soon, Festus came back.
It's no good. There are no boats left here.
He said to Rectina.
But what's that crazy young woman doing?
Pull her to this side of the street,
said Rectina.
but don't wake her up. She can see the future. Let's listen,
she added. Agatha spoke in her strange, low voice.
I'm lying in a small boat,
she said.
It's silver and very pretty. The gods are watching me.
Just a moment,
said Festus.
That's it. I forgot the boat we sometimes take out on summer days. The one I keep in the grotto in my garden. Only my slaves know about it, and they probably left on foot early this morning, when the stones started to fall.
Let's use that then.
Said Rectina. She opened the carriage door.
Hurry, Petrus!
She shouted.
We're going to walk along the beach to Festus's house to get his boat. We'll sail out to sea and meet the navy boats before these other people.
Petrus climbed out of the carriage with Bassus in his arms. Bassus was trying very hard to stand, but it was clear that he really couldn't walk very far.
Try harder, Father,
said Petrus.
I'm sorry, son. Something's wrong with my legs. I can't feel them.
A life of drinking and running after women has made him weak,
said Rectina.
Well, we can't carry him, and we must find Festus's boat fast. So let's leave him.
No, you go,
answered Petrus.
I'm staying here. With him.
I'll stay with you,
said Agatha, who had opened her eyes again and was speaking in her usual voice once more.
Come on, Rectina. Who cares about them?
Cried Festus. Together, Festus and Rectina started hurrying along the beach. They had covered their heads with cushions from the carriage to save themselves from the falling stones.
Go with them,
said Petrus to Agatha. Agatha looked at him, but did not move.
Agatha,
said Petrus.
Admiral Gaius Plinius is coming here with his ships to save us. Don't worry, we'll be fine. But if, by any chance, anything bad happens to me, please ask Felix to tell Flavia how much I loved her. He'll understand the message. Now go and find your boat and Felix.
With tears in her eyes, Agatha kissed Petrus and left him on the beach with his father. She followed Rectina and Festus, but it was difficult with her bad foot. She looked back once. There were people everywhere, running around and shouting. But two men were sitting together calmly in the middle of the crowds. They seemed to be happy. It was a picture she always remembered. By the time she reached Rectina and Festus, Agatha's foot was hurting badly.
So, you've decided to join us,
said Rectina.
Well, hurry up.
In half an hour, they reached Festus's garden and found the boat in the grotto. There was nobody at the house, but they sent Agatha for food and water to take with them. She was exhausted when she came back. Rectina and Festus carried the boat to the beach. Rectina and Agatha got in. Then Festus pushed the boat into the sea, but the waves kept pushing it back. Other people on the beach saw this and started running towards them.
Get us away from these people!
Rectina shouted at Festus. Agatha took another oar and tried to help Festus. The boat moved slowly away from the beach.
Row faster, you idiots!
Screamed Rectina.
Shut up!
Shouted Festus, against the noise of the wind and the crashing waves.
Don't talk to me like that!
Rectina screamed back. Festus hit her angrily with the oar to make her quiet. At the same time, a huge wave hit the boat, and Rectina fell into the sea. Agatha saw Rectina's head go under the water. She tried to grab her mistress, but the next wave washed Rectina far away.
Leave her!
Shouted Festus.
She can swim back to the beach. We must row on!
The air was getting hotter, and more stones and ash were coming out of the mountain. People on the beach started to walk into the water just because it was cooler. The boat drifted south with the wind, but there were people all around them in the sea because they were still near the land. Suddenly, one man tried to get into the boat by grabbing Festus's oar. Festus pulled back on the oar, but the man was stronger, and he pulled Festus into the sea with him. Agatha was now alone in the boat, which was still moving south. She saw desperate faces all around her in the water, but she was too tired to do anything. She lay down in the bottom of the boat.
Only the gods can help me now,
she thought, and she closed her eyes and fell asleep. When Gaius Plinius's ships arrived at Stabiae, more gas and fire came out of Vesuvius.
I'm going to a friend's house to sleep.
The old admiral told Felix.
Tomorrow morning, we'll save the people of Stabiae. Everyone on the ships needs a rest. You, more than anyone, my boy.
Thank you, sir,
answered Felix. He stood and watched Plinius go. How could he sleep? He knew Agatha and Petrus must be dead, and he wanted to die too. Then one of the sailors came out on deck.
Come inside with me.
He said kindly.
The hot stones are falling on you out here.
Felix was too tired to feel anything. He let the sailor take him inside and put him on a bed, where he soon fell asleep. Early the next morning, Gaius Plinius returned to the ships. He was coughing badly in the hot, smelly air. Crowds of people were waiting on the beach to leave. The sailors had told them to wait for the admiral. Plinius looked at the sea. It was still dark, and the waves were wilder than before. The terrible smell from the volcano was all around them, and it was difficult to breathe. The old man stared at all the people on the beach. He started to walk towards them, to explain that they had to sail as soon as they could. Suddenly, he fell to the ground. His sailors hurried to help him.
I can't breathe.
He whispered.
It's over for me. I'm dying. But you must sail as soon as you can and save all these people. Don't forget your duty as sailors in the Emperor's navy.
The old admiral turned his head towards Vesuvius.
All of this will stop sometime when the gods decide. Don't give up hope, men.
He coughed one more time, and then he died there on the hot ash, just beside his ships. "4 hours later, Felix woke up. The pillar of ash was still rising into the air, and it was still strangely dark for the time of day. Felix looked around him. Many people had escaped from the beach at Stabiae. He could see them on the admiral's ship where he was, and on the other Roman ships arranged in a circle in the sea around it. Gaius Plinius's ships were all riding the waves safely a short way from the coast. When Felix looked towards the land where Pompeii had once been, he could see only a desert of black stones through the greyish air. On the beach were many dead bodies. A few people were still alive there. They sat and waited for death to come to them. Felix saw a man and woman hugging 2 children. Fine pieces of ash rained down on them, covering them in a soft, thick blanket, like hot, grey snow.
Why am I living?
He thought.
Everyone I love is dead. I should be dead too.
He thought of Agatha, and tears ran down his face.
What's the matter?
Said one of the sailors, looking at him.
We're lucky. We're still alive. Even Gaius Plinius is dead.
Suddenly, another sailor shouted,
A boat!
A small, silver rowing boat was drifting slowly towards the ships. It was difficult to see clearly in the half-light coming from the ashy sky, but it seemed to be empty. Chapter 10. Back to Rome. Some sailors went to check the little silver boat. Felix watched without much interest as 2 sailors got into it.
There's a young woman here!
One of them shouted. They lifted a slim body into their bigger boat. Felix saw that she had long, blonde hair. Could it be Agatha? When the sailors carried the blonde-haired figure onto the ship, Felix ran over.
Agatha!
He shouted. She was with him again. But her eyes were closed, and she was very pale.
Is she dead?
He asked.
Not quite,
Said a sailor.
but she needs the ship's doctor.
Felix followed them, while they took Agatha inside.
Drink.
The doctor said, putting water to her lips. Agatha swallowed, and her eyes opened. She saw Felix and smiled. She tried to speak, but no sound came.
Don't talk.
Said the doctor.
Sleep. Your friend is with you.
Felix nodded. Agatha looked at him, and he took her hand. Slowly, she closed her eyes again.
When she wakes up, give her more water.
Said the doctor. While Felix waited by Agatha's side, he realized the ship was moving. The sailors had decided to sail away from Vesuvius with the people they had managed to save. They remembered what their admiral had said. The people needed to be somewhere safe. Also, someone must send word to the emperor. That evening, when Agatha woke up, she could talk again. She told Felix and the sailors everything she had seen in Pompeii and Herculaneum. The men shook their heads. Felix realized that probably thousands of people had died with Petrus and Bassus. The ships stopped at the next port along the coast. Messages were sent to Rome. But Agatha and Felix could think only about Alcander at Misenum. They wanted to go to him. But nobody wanted to go anywhere near Vesuvius.
I think it's best to go to Rome,
answered Felix.
We must tell Flavia about Petrus, and perhaps Spurius will help us to find Alcander. He's not a bad man. And in Rome, I have a job, so we can live there as man and wife, if you still want to marry me.
Agatha smiled.
Not even a volcano can change that.
So Felix and Agatha left the nightmare of Pompeii behind. 2 days later, they arrived at Spurius's house. When Felix walked into the hall, he saw Agatha's brother in Spurius's office.
Where can my sister and Felix be?
He was asking.
Anywhere,
Spurius answered.
if they're still alive.
Felix spoke quietly. He did not want Alcander to be too shocked.
Alcander, we're here.
The young Greek looked up suddenly.
Felix! Thank the gods! And Agatha?
She's outside,
answered Felix. Alcander hurried out to hug his sister. Felix stood before Spurius. The anger between them was long gone.
Felix,
said his old master.
I'm pleased to see you. Cassia will be too. We're both sorry about that business with the graffiti. Flavia explained it all to us in the end.
To Felix, that whole story seemed 100 years ago.
It's not important,
he said.
But how did Alcander find you?
He remembered my name. He thought you might bring his sister here. He was with Pliny's family. They knew how to find me.
How did they leave Misenum?
Felix asked.
They walked,
said a voice behind Felix.
Pliny's going to write all about it.
It was Cassia.
But how did you escape?
She added.
Cassia,
said Spurius.
I think Felix should eat and drink before you start questioning him.
Cassia blushed.
I'm sorry, Felix,
she said.
I'll order food and wine at once.
When Flavia came home from the market, Agatha took her quietly into the garden to tell her about Petrus. Flavia went to her room for several days after that and saw no one. Then, slowly, over the weeks and months that followed, she and Agatha became good friends. The next spring, Felix married Agatha. He stayed as a partner in the business with Spurius, and Alcander learned how to design and make mosaics too. 3 years later, Felix and Agatha had 2 young children, and Felix's mosaics were famous all over Rome. Spurius decided to retire and sold his half of the business to Felix. After that, Flavia often visited the workshop to meet Agatha and help with the children. Agatha noticed she liked talking to Alcander too. One day, Flavia came into the workshop while Felix was out visiting a customer. She seemed very excited.
The Emperor wants a mosaic to remember the people of Pompeii and Herculaneum,
she said.
Everyone thinks he'll ask Felix to design it. It'll be inside an important building in Rome. What do you think, Alcander? Will he do it?
I'm not sure.
Answered Alcander.
We don't like to remember Pompeii. I still have nightmares about it, you know, even today.
I think,
said Agatha slowly,
that Felix will do it. To honor all the people like Petrus who died.
A dark shadow crossed Flavia's face.
I hadn't thought of that,
she said. Flavia sat down, sad and alone. Agatha looked at Alcander. He was watching Flavia worriedly.
I'll fetch some more wine,
Agatha said, leaving the room. When Felix came home, she stopped him at the workshop door.
Let's go for a walk with the children,
she said.
Alcander and Flavia need some time together, and I have exciting news.
Why do they need time together?
Asked Felix.
Believe me, they do. Just come with me,
she said.
It's something a woman understands, and a man never will.